The Orc Bandit didn't start with the machete. She started with the words, flat, mechanical, like she'd said them 1,000 times, your coin or your life. But when he emptied his pockets and she turned to leave, something caught her. Her head tilted. Her nostrils flared. She grabbed the 5-year-old scarf from his neck, the one that still smelled faintly of rosemary, the last trace of his dead wife, and whispered something that stopped his heart. "You smell like my lost love." Then she removed her mask, and he saw the impossible. Behind the tusks and the green skin and the warrior's scars were the cheekbones, the jawline, the exact shade of his Mira's eyes. A beast fighting through a curse she didn't understand. This wasn't a robbery. This was a resurrection, and the story of how a rogue shaman's cruel experiment turned a wife into a bandit, and how a single scent on an old scarf began to break the spell, is only the beginning. That man was Caleb, a farmer who hadn't touched a weapon since his wife Mira died of the wasting sickness 5 years ago. All he carried was a sack of grain and a scarf that still smelled of her hands. He had no idea that a rogue shaman had been digging up the recently dead and reforging them into orcish forms, burying their human memories beneath layers of instinct and rage. The bandit who stopped him was Mira, trapped in a body she didn't recognize, with a past she couldn't reach. The rosemary unlocked it. And for the first time in 5 years, Caleb had a reason to fight. Not for his life, but for hers. This is the story of the second chance no one thought possible, and the curse that would do anything to stop it. The road to Thornhaven was 6 miles of packed dirt and old sorrow, and Caleb walked it the same way he had walked it every month for 5 years. Since the day they buried Mira under the willow tree behind the farmhouse, he had kept his head down and his hands busy. The sack of grain on his shoulder was meant for the miller. The coin it would bring meant for lamp oil and salt and the other small necessities that kept a solitary life from collapsing into total neglect. The scarf was his one indulgence. A frayed strip of wool dyed blue, still faintly scented with rosemary from the bundle Mira had tucked into the drawer the week before the fever took her. He wore it around his neck even in summer, and when the loneliness pressed too hard, he lifted it to his face and let the smell carry him backward. To the sound of her voice, to the warmth of her hands kneading bread dough, to the 3 years of marriage that had been the only bright thing in a life otherwise built from work and silence. The forest road cut through the elder grove, a stretch of old-growth timber where the canopy swallowed the light and the birds fell quiet around midday. Travelers avoided it when they could. The orc bands that roamed the northern territories had been pushed back from the main trade routes years ago, but the elder grove was deep and tangled, and lawlessness grew there like moss. Caleb had heard the stories. A machete-wielding woman with green skin and a leather mask who stopped every cart and rider. Some said she was a deserter from the clan wars. Some said a spirit bound to the wood. None of it mattered to him. Grief had carved out everything inside him that could still feel fear. He was a man who had already lost the one thing worth protecting. What was a bandit going to take from him that the wasting sickness hadn't already taken first? She stepped from behind the dead oak at the bend in the road, and he stopped. The machete was in her right hand, the blade nicked but clean, held with the casual authority of someone who had used it many times. She was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing patched leather and a strip of hide across the lower half of her face. Her eyes above the mask were amber, sharp, scanning him with the disinterested efficiency of a predator deciding whether prey was worth the effort. "Coin," she said. Not a question. Not a threat either. Just the flat, mechanical tone of a transaction that had been repeated so often it had worn every edge smooth. Caleb let the grain sack fall and reached into his pockets. He had 4 coppers and a silver piece he'd been saving for a new hoe blade. He held them out. She took them without looking, her gaze still fixed on his face in a way that made the hairs on his arms rise. Then she turned to leave. The wind shifted. A downdraft through the canopy caught the scent of rosemary and carried it to her, and she stopped mid-step. Her shoulders tightened. She turned back slowly, her head tilting as if following a sound only she could hear. Her amber eyes widened, then narrowed, and she moved toward him with a speed that was not predatory but desperate, yanking the scarf from his neck before he could flinch. She pressed the fabric to her face and inhaled, and when she spoke her voice was no longer flat. It was broken, dragged up from some deep fissure that had been sealed for a very long time. "You smell like my lost love," she whispered. She reached up with her free hand and pulled the leather mask away from her face. Caleb stopped breathing. The green skin was smooth. The small tusks that jutted from her lower jaw were unmistakable. The scars along her temple were fresh and unfamiliar. But the cheekbones, the jawline, the exact tilt of her eyes looking up at him with puzzled, flickering recognition, those were Mira's. Every line, every curve, every detail he had memorized across 3 years of marriage and 5 years of grief was right there, staring at him from behind a body that should have been impossible. He opened his mouth, and the word came out before he could think. Mira. Something cracked inside her armor. A sound not physical, but felt. A splintering of whatever wall had been built inside her mind. She stumbled back, her hand going to her head as if in sudden pain, and for a moment her eyes cleared. She looked at him not as a bandit sizing up prey, but as a woman who had just surfaced from a very deep water and found a man she recognized. "Caleb," she said, and her voice was hers again, thin and bewildered and wrapped in 5 years of silence. And then the shaman's binding reasserted itself. Her face twisted, her tusks bared, and she doubled over with a growl that was not human. The curse was not finished. The rogue shaman who had raised her from the grave, who had reshaped her flesh and buried her memories beneath layers of orcish instinct and obedient rage, had built his magic to endure. Recognition was a crack, not a collapse. She straightened, and her eyes were half hers and half something else, a war being fought behind amber irises. "Run," she said through clenched teeth. "He's coming. The bond breaks, and he will feel it." Caleb grabbed the scarf from the ground and wrapped it around his hand. He did not run. He had been running from the emptiness of that farmhouse for 5 years, and he was done running. Whoever had done this to her, whoever had stolen his wife and remade her into a weapon, was about to learn what a man with nothing left to lose could still destroy. She said his name, and the curse pushed back. Her whole body seized, amber light flaring behind her eyes like a drowning sun. The hand that had touched the scarf curled into a claw, and for a moment the bandit was all that remained, brutal, feral, ready to strike. Caleb didn't move. He had spent 5 years learning to read Mira's face in every light, and he could see the real her struggling beneath the surface like a swimmer caught under ice. "Fight it," he said. "Whatever they did to you, you're still in there." His voice was the second anchor. The first had been the rosemary. The third, it turned out, was her name, spoken by the one person who had never stopped speaking it. Her shoulders dropped. The snarl faded. And Mira, his Mira, looked at him through the cracks of the monster and said, "Hurry, he knows." The shaman's name was Urzak. He made his lair in the Black Fang Spire, a crooked tower of dark stone that jutted from the wastes beyond the Thornback Pass. He was a deserter from the Orc clans, a bone singer who had been exiled for tampering with the dead, and for 10 years He had been perfecting a ritual the clans refused to name aloud. He dug up fresh graves and rebuilt the bodies, splicing orcish sinew into human frames, infusing the corpses with the strength and fury of a warrior caste. Then he broke their spirits and bound them to his will, erasing everything they had been so that only obedient instruments remained. The bandits who terrorized the Elder Grove were not outlaws. They were his revenants, returned from death and stripped of memory, roaming the roads to steal the resources his experiments required. Mira had been his greatest success, the first to fully integrate the graft without rotting. He had not counted on the rosemary. He had not counted on a man too stubborn to stop loving a ghost. Mira stumbled to the edge of the road, and the leaves beneath her feet caught fire. Not real fire. The pale blue witchlight that accompanied a revenant recall spell. Miles away, Urzok had felt the bond fracture and was pulling her back. She dug her heels into the earth and screamed through clenched teeth. Caleb grabbed her arm. The instant his skin touched hers, the blue light guttered and died. She stared at the place where his hand met her wrist. The recall stopped. For some reason, the shaman could not see Caleb, could not pull her while he held on. They would have to figure out why later. For now, it meant she could stay. They had a window, maybe hours, before Urzok sent something worse. The farmhouse was 2 miles east, and Mira's legs gave out before they reached the willow tree. Caleb carried her the last 200 yards, as she had once carried him through a fever winter, and when he laid her on the dusty floor of their kitchen, she wept. The tears were green-tinged, the salt of a body that was no longer entirely human, but the sound was Mira's, the same hiccuping sob he had heard when the wasting sickness was first diagnosed. He held her, and the years fell away. She remembered everything now, the rosemary, the bread dough, the way the morning light fell across their bed. But she also remembered the black chamber, the bone singer's chant, the weight of a mask that became her face. She remembered the things she had done. "You have to know," she said. "I hurt people, Caleb. I broke a merchant's arm. I stole from families. He stopped her. That was not you. That was the thing he built around you. The woman who taught a stray dog to herd sheep is still here." She looked at him, and for the first time in 5 years, hope flickered behind the amber. But the shaman was not idle. In the Blackfang spire, Urzok stood over a stone basin filled with dark water and watched his revenants' faces ripple one by one. Mira's was absent. He could still feel the tether that bound her, a thread of black ichor woven through her heart, but he could not see through her eyes, could not hear through her ears. Something had erected a barrier. His long fingers traced the basin's rim. He had used the hair from her death shroud to craft the bond, and only a token of greater emotional weight could suppress it. A token like a scarf saturated in a living memory. He smiled, a thin expression that did not reach his eyes. Let the farmer keep his charm. He would send 4 revenants instead of 1, and they would bring back the girl and the token together. Then he would make the farmer watch while he rebuilt his wife again, slower this time. The first sign of trouble came with the birds. An hour past noon, every crow in the Elder Grove took flight at once, a black cloud rising without sound. Caleb was boarding up the kitchen window when the tracker arrived. Her name was Sarah Tideborn, a ranger from the Thornback garrison, and she had been hunting the bandits for 6 months. She walked out of the tree line with a crossbow slung across her back and a scar across her jaw that looked fresh. She saw Mira and raised the bow. "Don't." Caleb stepped between them. "She's my wife." Sarah stared at the green-skinned woman crouched on the kitchen floor, at the tusks and the warrior's scars, at the amber eyes that were somehow both predatory and terrified. "Your wife is an orc," Sarah said. "She was resurrected by a bone singer," Caleb replied, "and right now she's the only person who can tell you how to stop him." Sarah lowered the bow slowly. She had been tracking Urzak's supply lines for weeks and had lost 2 rangers to his revenants. Intelligence from inside the network was worth more than a prisoner. She sat at the table, crossbow across her knees, and listened. Mira told her everything. The spire had a garrison of 20 revenants at any given time, all bound to the bone singer's will through a crystalline heartstone embedded in the tower's central chamber. The heartstone pulsed with the stolen life force of every resurrected victim. Destroy it, and the bindings would sever. Every revenant would be freed, or collapse, depending on how much of their original body remained. For Mira, it would mean the orc parts of her would die, but the human core might survive if they could get her to a healer fast enough. Sarah absorbed this with the grim acceptance of someone who had been losing a war. "The problem," she said, "is getting in. The spire is warded, and Urzak can sense any living creature that crosses the perimeter. He sees through the revenant's eyes, but he also feels every footfall on the stone. You can't sneak up on him." That's when Caleb realized why the recall spell had failed. The scarf. Mira's scent. His scent. Their shared history. The bond was built from a death shroud, a token of loss. The scarf was a token of love still living. It didn't break the tether, but it blinded the shaman. If he was holding Mira, Urzak could not see them. They had a way in. Sarah laid out a plan. She would draw the revenants away with a diversion, a signal fire at the edge of the wastes. Caleb and Mira would use the distraction to climb the spire's western face, where the wards were weakest, and reach the Heartstone chamber. They would have minutes before Urzak realized the attack was a feint. Once inside, they would need to shatter the crystal and then fight their way out past a tower full of confused, possibly hostile revenants who would suddenly regain their memories. Sarah looked at Caleb. "You're a farmer, not a soldier. You've never killed anyone. Are you prepared to end the life of a bone singer if it comes to that?" Caleb reached into the sack he had brought from the road and pulled out Mira's machete, the blade she had dropped when the curse cracked. He weighed it in his hands. "No, but I'm prepared to protect my wife." "That will have to be enough." They left at dusk. Sarah melted into the forest toward the pass, and Caleb helped Mira through the back fields toward the Thornback Road. She was stronger now, the weakness fading as the curse recalibrated around the rosemary anchor. But every few steps, a tremor ran through her, the shaman's voice faint in her mind, demanding obedience. She gritted her teeth and kept walking. "You said you remembered everything from our marriage," Caleb said as they crossed the old stone bridge that marked the boundary of their land. "Is there anything that we had that he couldn't have touched? A memory strong enough to hold you if things go bad in there?" She thought for a long moment, and then a small, sad smile crossed her lips. "The song you used to hum when you fixed the fence. You never knew I could hear you from the kitchen window. You were always off-key. Hum it now, and I will follow you anywhere." He hummed. Out of tune, wavering, a farmer's lullaby with no words. And as the Black Fang spire rose before them against a bruised sky, she walked beside him with the unshakable steadiness of a woman who had been given back the music that the grave had stolen. They reached the base of the spire just as Sarah's signal fire lit the horizon, a bloom of orange against the black, and from the tower windows came the shriek of winged revenants scrambling to investigate. The western wall was sheer, but Mira's orcish strength made short work of the handholds, and Caleb followed in her footsteps. A quarter of the way up, his foot slipped, and he dangled by one hand, the machete clattering against the stone. She caught his wrist and hauled him onto a ledge as casually as he had once lifted a hay bale. Left-hand dominant, she noted, and for a tiny instant, it was no longer a rescue, but a wife chiding her husband about his clumsiness. The normalcy of it nearly broke him. They climbed on. At the top, a narrow slit window led into a corridor thick with the smell of rot and incense. Caleb could hear chanting in a language that felt like cold oil on the skin. They had found the Heartstone Chamber. They had found Urzak. And they had maybe 60 seconds before the revenants returned. The chanting stopped the moment Caleb's boots touched the stone floor. The chamber was vast and circular, lit by a pale green glow that pulsed from a crystal the size of a man's chest, suspended in a web of blackened chains above an altar of fused bone. Urzak turned from his work. He was thinner than Caleb expected, his frame swallowed by robes stitched from burial shrouds, his tusks filed to needle points. His eyes were the color of old blood, and they fixed on Mira with the possessive calm of a craftsman inspecting his finest work. "You brought a guest," he said. "How sentimental." Caleb raised the machete. The blade shook once, then steadied. "Let her go." Urzak tilted his head as if examining a curious insect. "Let her go? I built her. The woman you married died of a wasting sickness. Her lungs filled with fluid, her organs failed, and by the time I found her in the graveyard, the worms had already started their work." He gestured at Mira with a long gray finger. "This is not resurrection. This is reconstruction. I used what remained, bone structure, muscle memory, the residue of a soul too stubborn to dissolve, and I gave it a new vessel. Orcish sinew, Orcish blood, an Orcish will, buried deep beneath a copy of the original personality. She is my greatest achievement. She is not your wife." Mira made a sound, a low keening that started in her chest and cut off as if someone had clamped a hand over her mouth. Caleb felt the weight of the words settle into his gut. He looked at her, at the amber eyes, the green skin, the tusks, and then he remembered the way she had wept in the kitchen, the way she had hummed along to his off-key fence-mending song. He remembered the exact pitch of her laugh, and he knew that whatever she was now, she was still the woman he had promised to love until death. And death, it turned out, had not been the end. "You're wrong," he said. "She remembers me. She remembers everything, because you gave her a trigger," Urzak said, his voice going cold. "The rosemary. A sensory anchor from her former life. I accounted for the possibility of traumatic recall, but I underestimated the persistence of a widower. No matter." He raised his hand, and the chains above the heartstone began to rattle. "The recall is not a spell I cast. It is a function of the crystal. Destroy the heartstone, and every revenant in the tower will have their bindings severed, including hers. And do you know what happens to a body held together by borrowed magic when the source is removed? It dies. Not in minutes or hours, in seconds." Caleb's grip on the machete tightened. He had come here to break the crystal, to free Mira and the others. But if freeing her meant killing her, then the entire plan collapsed. Urzak saw the hesitation and smiled. "You see the dilemma. You cannot destroy me without destroying her. And you cannot leave her with me, because I will simply rebuild her. Again and again. Until the memory of the rosemary is drowned beneath so many layers of reconstruction that nothing of your wife remains." He stepped forward, and the air grew thick with the smell of grave dirt. "Lay down the blade, farmer. I will make this quick. Refuse, and I will make it slow. And I will make her watch." That was when Mira moved. She had been standing motionless, fighting the pull of the recall, But something in Urzak's threat triggered a deeper instinct. Her hand shot out and grabbed the shaman by the throat, lifting him off the ground. The chains convulsed, and the heartstone flared bright as the bond strained against her rebellion. She was not supposed to be able to attack him. The binding was absolute. Yet here she was, holding her creator aloft, amber fire blazing in her eyes. Because the rosemary hadn't just unlocked her memories. It had planted a second anchor, a loyalty older and stronger than the curse, the vow she had made on her wedding day. I will love you until death. And death had already come and gone. The vow still held. Urzuk choked out a word, a guttural syllable that twisted the air like a blade. The heartstone pulsed once, and Mira screamed. Her grip failed, and the shaman dropped to the floor. She staggered backward, clutching her chest, where the black ichor of the tether was visible beneath her skin, writhing like a living thing. He cannot kill me, Urzak rasped, crawling toward the altar. But I can hurt her. I can hurt her until she begs for obedience. And I will, unless you put down the weapon. Caleb looked at Mira, at the agony written across her face, and he made a decision. He laid the machete on the floor. Urzak rose, smoothing his robes, and the chains slowly stilled. Inside the heartstone, a faint shape began to form. Not a reflection, a presence. Urzak noticed it first, his smug expression cracking into confusion. What is that? The shape sharpened, a woman's silhouette, pale and wavering, standing inside the crystal's core. Mira's ghost, not the reconstructed orc Mira, but the original human woman, the one who had died of the wasting sickness 5 years ago. Her eyes were closed, her hands folded over her chest, and she was dissolving. The heartstone didn't just bind the revenants, Caleb realized. It fed on the souls of the dead. Urzak wasn't resurrecting bodies, he was trapping souls in a crystal prison and using their energy to animate the orc vessels. The real Mira was still in there, and the longer the crystal burned, the more of her it consumed. That was why the rosemary had worked, because her soul was still intact enough to recognize him. But if they waited any longer, there would be nothing left to save. Urzak saw the direction of Caleb's gaze and snarled. A technical complication. The soul is difficult to extract fully. It lingers, clings to the body's memory. But eventually, it burns away. A few more weeks, and your wife would have been nothing but a shell. Now you've arrived just in time to watch the final stages. The silhouette inside the crystal flickered, and Caleb understood the true stakes. Breaking the heartstone might kill the revenant bodies, but if the soul was still trapped inside, it would be freed. Mira's body would die, but her soul might pass on peacefully. Or it might not. They hadn't considered a third option. Sira's voice cut through the chamber from the corridor. The ranger had scaled the spire behind them, apparently having decided the diversion wasn't worth missing the main assault. She stood in the doorway with her crossbow raised, and behind her, 2 of the revenants she had supposedly lured away were standing still, their eyes unfocused. They had followed her back. Not attacking, waiting, because Urzak had recalled them, and now the chamber was surrounded. 6 more revenants filed in from the upper passages, their faces blank, their weapons drawn. The 60-second window had closed. They were trapped. Urzak spread his arms as if welcoming an audience. Perfect timing. Now the farmer can watch as I remind his wife what obedience feels like. He turned to Mira, who was still gasping on the floor, and began to chant. The ichor tendrils across her body flared, and she screamed again, her back arching off the stone. Caleb lunged for the machete, but a revenant intercepted him, its blade pressing against his throat. Sarah fired a bolt into one of the revenants, but 2 more seized her arms. The shaman's control was absolute inside the tower. They had walked into his seat of power, with no plan except determination, and now they were paying for it. But something was happening to Mira. As the chant intensified, her screams shifted. The amber light in her eyes didn't dim, it brightened, and the green of her skin began to glow from within. The ichor tendrils writhed and then began to recede, retreating from her heart as if repelled. The wedding vow. Caleb realized the second anchor was more than sentiment. It was a counterspell. The rosemary had been the key, but the vow was the lock. Mira had promised to love him until death, and she had died still loving him. And that promise had followed her soul into the grave and into the revenant body. Urzak's binding was built on death. The vow was built on something death couldn't break, and now the two were colliding. The heartstone cracked. A thin fracture ran down its center, and the green light inside flickered. Urzak's chant faltered. He stared at the crack as if the laws of reality had just been rewritten. "Impossible," he whispered. "The tether is absolute." "Not absolute," Mira said, her voice steady now. She pushed herself to her feet, and the ichor tube detached from her chest with a wet snap, dangling uselessly. The revenants around the room shuddered, their own bindings momentarily destabilized by the cascade. Sarah wrenched free and grabbed her crossbow. Caleb drove an elbow into the revenant holding him and rolled for the machete. Urzak backed toward the altar, his composure gone. "You don't understand what you're doing. If the heartstone shatters, it won't just kill the revenants. It will release every soul trapped inside. Dozens of them, freed to wander the mortal plane with no body, no anchor. They'll become wraiths, hungry, mindless. He stopped, because the heartstone cracked again, and this time a voice emerged from it. Not Mira's voice. A chorus of voices, dozens of them, whispering in overlapping cadences. The trapped souls were awake. Caleb reached Mira's side. The glow in her skin was still building, and he could feel heat radiating from her. "The vow is burning through the curse," she said. "But I can feel it pulling me apart. If the heartstone goes, my body goes with it. There has to be another way." Sarah, from the doorway, had reloaded her crossbow. She was looking at the revenants, who had stopped moving entirely, as if listening to something only they could hear. The voices from the crystal were getting louder. She shouted over the noise. "If we can't destroy it, can we transfer her? Transfer the binding from the crystal to something else? An anchor strong enough to keep her body alive without the stone." Caleb thought of the scarf. The rosemary had already proven it could hold a fragment of her soul. But holding a fragment and holding an entire life force were two different orders of magnitude. They would need something deeper. Something that represented the full scope of their bond. Mira looked at Caleb, and her expression was the one she used to wear when she'd just solved a stubborn kitchen problem. "The song," she said, "not just the scarf. The song. You have to sing it. Here, now, with the crystal open." The vow made audible, the sound of the promise carried in a melody. Urzak's chant had been words of control. Music might be the opposite. Caleb swallowed. He hadn't sung in front of anyone but the fence posts. But the crack in the heartstone was widening, and the revenants were beginning to stir, and the shaman was already formulating a new spell. So he started to hum. Off-key. Wobbling, a simple three-note tune that had no lyrics, because the meaning was in the cadence, not the words. The tune of a man fixing a fence while his wife listened through the window, storing up the sound like sunlight against a winter day. The heartstone's fracture widened, and for a moment, nothing else happened. And then Mira began to change, not revert, transform. The green of her skin softened, the tusks receded a fraction, and the scars along her temples smoothed. The orcish frame was still there, but the edges blurred, as if the original human shape was pressing outward from within. The ichor in her veins was being purged, replaced by something gold and warm. The vow was rewriting her, not as the woman she had been, but as something new, a bridge between the soul and the reconstructed flesh, a living anchor powered by a love that had outlasted a grave. The Heartstone screamed, not a vocal scream, a psychic shriek that reverberated through every revenant in the tower. The crystal's hold was breaking. Urzok, desperate now, threw himself at the altar and pressed both hands to the stone, trying to reassert control. But the chorus of the dead was louder, and the gold light from Mira was brighter. And then the first chain snapped. Then another. The Heartstone began to rise, no longer anchored, floating on a cloud of released energy. The trapped souls were no longer whispering. They were singing, a discordant hymn of rage and relief. And in the center of the chamber, Caleb kept humming, because he had nothing else, and it was working. The moment of decision arrived like a blade. Mira, now half transformed, turned to Caleb and placed her palm against his chest. "You have to stop the hymn," she said. "If I complete the transformation with the crystal unbroken, I'll still be connected to it. The tether will regrow. I need you to trust me. I'm going to walk into the Heartstone. The crystal will interpret my new body as a foreign element and try to absorb it. When it does, the vow will overload it from the inside. The stone will shatter, the souls will be freed, and she paused. I don't know what will happen to me. I might die. I might become something else. But it's the only way." Caleb caught her hand. "No, we'll find another way. There isn't time," she said. "The revenants are waking up, and Urzok is regaining his strength. The window is seconds." She kissed him. Not a gentle kiss, a fierce, desperate press of lips against lips, tusks lightly grazing his cheek. Then she pulled away, and before he could stop her, she walked into the Heartstone. The crystal swallowed her whole. The golden light vanished into the green, and the fracture sealed behind her. For one heartbeat, the chamber was silent. Then, the Heartstone exploded. The explosion was silent. A sphere of green and gold light expanded from the spot where the Heartstone had hung, swallowing the altar, the chains, and the shaman in one clean wave. Then the sound caught up, a deep, rolling crack that shook the spire down to its foundations. Caleb was thrown backward against the stone wall, the machete spinning from his hand, and the world became a smear of color and pressure. He heard Sarah shout something from the doorway, and then the revenants began to fall. One by one, the Orcish warriors dropped their weapons. Some crumpled where they stood, their bodies finally catching up to the death they had been denied. Others sank to their knees, their eyes clearing for a single moment of recognition before the light went out. A few, those whose transformations had been too extensive to survive without the crystal's power, simply turned to dust, their ashes spiraling upward as if chasing the souls that had once inhabited them. None of them screamed. The bindings severed cleanly, and what remained was the quiet aftermath of a prison being dismantled. Sarah, braced against the doorframe, watched the revenants dissolve and whispered a prayer she hadn't spoken in years. Urzok did not dissolve. He was still standing, or what was left of him was standing, his robes smoking and his needle tusks cracked, his red eyes wide with the particular terror of a man who has just watched his life's work unravel in 3 heartbeats. He tried to speak, to cast, to summon some final reserve of dark magic, but the explosion had not only broken the Heartstone, it had cut the channel between him and the stolen souls. He was empty, a bone singer with no bones to sing. He opened his mouth, and nothing came out, not a word, not a curse, not even a scream. Then the floor beneath him, weakened by the blast, gave way, and Urzok tumbled into the darkness below the chamber, his robes flaring like a dying star before the shadows swallowed him whole. Caleb pushed himself up on trembling arms. The room was silent again, but a different kind of silent. Not the thick, oppressive quiet of a tomb, but the clean, hollow quiet of a place that had been emptied of something terrible. He crawled toward the center of the chamber, where the altar had been. Nothing remained but a scorched circle on the stone and a fine dusting of crystal shards that glittered in the fading light. And in the center of that circle, lying on her side as if she had simply fallen asleep, was Mira. Her skin was no longer green. It was the warm brown Caleb remembered from their wedding day, but threaded through with faint golden lines that traced her veins like a second circulatory system. Her tusks had receded to subtle points, just barely visible when her lips parted, and the warrior's scars along her temple had softened into pale markings that looked less like wounds and more like deliberate patterns, a map of survival rather than injury. Her hair, which the transformation had left dark and tangled, now fell around her shoulders in waves, and the tips were touched with gold. She was breathing. The amber eyes flickered open, and they were no longer a stranger's eyes. They were Mira's, exactly as they had been before the fever took her, with one difference: a ring of gold encircling each iris, the visible remnant of the vow that had burned through the curse. He reached her, and she reached back, and their hands met in the space where her heartbeat used to be. The rosemary scent was stronger now, not just on the scarf, but pouring from her skin, as if the anchor had become part of her. She smiled, and it was the same crooked, slightly too wide smile that had first made him fall in love with her at a harvest fair 12 years ago. "I heard you humming," she said. "You're still off key." He laughed and cried at the same time, the sounds tangling in his throat until he couldn't tell which was which, and he pulled her into his arms and held her the way a drowning man holds a piece of driftwood. Sarah approached carefully, crossbow lowered, her face a study in professional composure, barely managing to contain genuine astonishment. "The other revenants are gone," she said. "All of them." Most turned to dust. A few collapsed and didn't rise. "You're the only one who came through intact." Mira looked at her hands, flexing the fingers that had once held a machete to a merchant's throat. "The souls," she said. "The ones trapped in the crystal. I felt them. When the stone shattered, they were pulled toward me. Not to attack, to pass through. The vow acted as a doorway. They needed an anchor of love to follow into whatever comes next. So I let them. Every single one. That was the light you saw. That was the release." Sarah stared at her, and a rare crack appeared in the ranger's stoic expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight tremor in the jaw. The stories said destroying the crystal would make wraiths. The shaman believed it. But it didn't create wraiths. It created an exodus. "So the old legends were wrong," Mira said. "Or maybe they were right, and we just added a new ending." That felt right. The whole story, from the wasting sickness to the bone singer's spire, had been one long accumulation of endings that didn't stick. Death hadn't taken her. The curse hadn't broken her. And the Heartstone, for all its terrible power, had been undone by a widower humming off key in a dark room. They searched the tower's lower levels before leaving, but Urzok's body was not found. The darkness he had fallen into seemed bottomless, or perhaps simply unwilling to give up its secrets. Sarah marked the spire as a restricted site and sent word to the Thornback garrison to begin a formal investigation. The rangers would seal the entrances, catalog the remains of the revenants, and ensure that no other bone singer ever used the spire again. But Caleb and Mira did not stay for the aftermath. They had a farmhouse to return to, and a willow tree in the backyard that had stood over an empty grave for 5 years. The walk out of the elder grove was slower than the walk in. Mira's body was still adjusting to its new equilibrium, and she leaned on Caleb's arm more often than she would have admitted. But she did not stumble, and the rosemary scent trailed behind them like a benediction. The trees that had loomed with menace on the way to the spire now seemed merely old, tired, scarred by past storms, but still standing. A crow watched them from a branch, then took flight. The same crow, perhaps, that had scattered with the flock when the revenants were first summoned. Now it flew ahead of them, leading the way out. They reached the farmhouse at sunset. The roof was still sagging, the fence was still losing its argument with gravity, and the kitchen window still had the crack that had been there since the winter after the wedding. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Mira walked through the front door and touched every surface: the table, the hearth, the wooden spoon she had carved from a fallen branch. The memories were all there, undimmed, waiting. The Orc Bandit who had terrorized the Elder Grove was gone, and in her place was a woman who had carried the weight of a prison and then laid it down. She looked out the kitchen window at the willow tree, and for a long moment she was silent. "I remember dying," she said quietly. "Not the pain. The moment after. There was a light and a voice, and I thought, this is it, this is the end. But then there was a pause, like the universe was waiting for something. And then I heard you humming, from the other side of the yard, fixing the fence. And I turned around. I didn't go into the light because you were still here, and I wasn't finished. That was the first anchor. The rosemary came later. The vow was first." Caleb wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "You stayed," he said. "You always did the stubborn thing." She laughed, and it was the same laugh, the one that had convinced him to dance with her at the harvest fair when he had sworn he didn't know how. The scarf that had started it all hung now from a peg by the door, still smelling faintly of rosemary. But the scent was fainter now, as if the task it had been given was complete and it could finally rest. In the weeks that followed, Mira's golden markings gradually faded until they were only visible in direct sunlight, and her tusks receded entirely, leaving only the slightest emphasis on her canines that made her smile a little sharper than before. She was neither human nor orc, and she was both. A new category, a one-of-a-kind result of love refusing to end. Sarah visited once to deliver a report from the garrison. The tower had been purged, the remaining artifacts destroyed, and no trace of Urzok had been found. The Thornback Rangers had added Mira's testimony to their records under a new designation: Revenant Zero, the first and only successful reclamation. They offered her a position as a consultant, if she wanted it. Mira looked at the willow tree, at the garden she wanted to replant, at the man who had walked into a dark tower with nothing but a tune and a promise. "I think I'm done with wars," she said. "But if you ever need someone who knows what it's like to be remade, you know where I am." And so the farmhouse returned to its quiet rhythm. Caleb went back to mending fences, still off-key, still humming the same 3 notes, and Mira stood in the kitchen window, listening. The road through the elder grove stayed empty of bandits, and the travelers who passed by said the forest felt different now. Lighter, as if something heavy had been lifted. They were right. The Bone Singer's spire still stood, empty and sealed, a monument to a cruelty that had been undone. And the man and woman at the end of the Thornback Road continued to live a life that had been interrupted by death, and then resumed, not as it was before, but as something braided from loss and resurrection, from rosemary and vows and the stubborn belief that love written into a melody could outlast a grave. They were stained by impossible things. But they were walking, And for the first time since the wasting sickness, the road ahead was not a road of grief, but a road of morning light and open sky, and the simple, staggering promise of another day together. The story of Caleb and Mira didn't end with the shaman's fall or the long walk home. It continued in the small, unremarkable moments that make up a life. The smell of bread in the morning, the creak of a fence gate, the sound of humming drifting through a kitchen window. But underneath the ordinary, something extraordinary had taken root. A man and a woman who had both, in different ways, crossed over into the territory of the impossible and returned hand in hand. Mira's body was a mosaic of two worlds. The golden light that had rewritten her veins faded slowly over weeks until it was only visible in certain angles of sunlight. But it never disappeared entirely. The warriors in Thornhaven who heard her story treated her with a kind of reverent curiosity, as if she were a living relic. She wasn't a relic. She was a farmer's wife who happened to have tusks and a direct line to the afterlife. Urzok was never found. Scouts searched the ruins of the Black Fang spire for months and found only silence and shadows. The shaman had been swallowed by the darkness below his own altar, and whether he died or simply vanished into a deeper hole, no one could say. Some nights, Mira would stand at the edge of the elder grove and listen, but the forest gave back only the rustle of leaves. The bone singer's reign was over, but the possibility of his return lingered, a thin thread of unease woven into the peace they had fought for. Yet that unease did not define them. It sharpened their appreciation for every ordinary day. The garden that Mira replanted bloomed with herbs she hadn't grown since before her death: rosemary, thyme, lavender. The willow tree that had shaded her empty grave now shaded two chairs, one slightly more worn than the other, and the scarf, still carrying its faint scent, hung by the door as a reminder not of loss, but of a connection that had refused to break. The broader truth of their story is both simple and staggering. We build our lives around anchors we rarely notice. A song hummed off key, the smell of rosemary, the way someone's hand feels in yours. These are not trivial things. They are the architecture of the soul. When the world tries to tear a person away, through death, through trauma, through the slow erosion of time, it is these anchors that hold them, that call them back, that remind them who they are and who they love. The Rangers of Thornback still speak of Revenant Zero, not as a cautionary tale, but as a proof of concept. If one bond could break a curse, could others? Could the lost be found by the people who refuse to stop looking? Mira's existence suggests the answer is yes. The road from the Elder Grove remains open. Travelers sometimes catch a scent of rosemary on the wind, and a few of them pause, remembering a lost love of their own. And if they listen closely, they might hear, in the distance, the sound of a man humming off key, fixing a fence that will never quite stand straight, while his wife watches from the kitchen window, her amber eyes catching the light, her smile just a little too wide, and her heart beating with a rhythm that belongs to both this world and the next. If this story resonated with you, make sure to hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another. Tell us in the comments, what scent, sound, or memory would you use as an anchor if you had to pull someone back from the dark? We read every comment, and you might just inspire a future story. Until next time, keep your anchors close. You never know when you'll need them.